So this is 10 past 3 GMT in the afternoon of Monday, the 14th of September 2020. And this is the latest edition of the Diagnosis of Fleet Street today. What is today? Today is the day which happens to be the day when the United Nations Human Rights Council is sitting and started sitting in the 45th session, I think, in Switzerland at Geneva. Does it matter? It doesn't matter to the British newspapers. In fact, the British newspapers are boasting of violating the UN human rights declarations and commitments and all the other things. And the people sitting in that assembly in Switzerland are also quite complacent, especially as the so-called reports, those are the routines that they performed about the Rohingyas being massacred and the genocide. And the report was presented in a way like it's like a ritual. It's like chore. It's a chore. It's like something you do in the kitchen. It doesn't involve anything significantly new or different. It's one of the daily routines that you do, or the annual or the periodic session that you have. And the whole atmosphere is completely, totally dismal because there is no excitement about any activities that is measurable by the yardstick of the declarations and the obligations of the member states or the powers of the United Nations organizations to create a compelling atmosphere about a genociding state or country or mass murdering regime. And it also happens to be within the 48 hours of the reports coming from the borders between Bangladesh and Burma, that Bangladesh has protested to the Burmese about suspicious movement of troops along the borders. Now, that's not far from Cox's Bazar, where the majority of the Rohingya refugees who desperately fled Burma 3 years ago. So what is the Human Rights Council doing about that? There is no squeak. There hasn't been any squeak heard about that so far as I have been able to access it. And I mean, the newspapers in this country, in Britain, they're celebrating the flouting of human rights and flouting of the United Nations. It's as open, as brazen as that. So they have scrapped the United Nations, in effect, when it comes to this kind of function that the United Nations was founded to carry out and discharge, defending people and their human rights and save them from genocide and massacres. And the Boris graph, as I said earlier in the previous edition, is full of complacent stuff that are geared to denying the duties owed to the public under the law and obligations imposed on the state to save people and safeguard people. So there is only one piece on page 4, which says curfew, the obvious next step if new rules fail. Now, to many observers, these measures or these threats or threatened kind of harsh actions by the state are not about protecting people from the disease or the virus, but using the virus as a pretext, as an excuse, as a cover to break more laws and break more rights and abolish more rights and gather more evidence against people for completely unconnected, unrelated purposes. And that is what the angle is, the civil liberties angle. And the civil liberties angle, I'll come to that, and I'll come to that in the context of the role played by the courts, bureaucracies. I mean, I have said many times that Keir Starmer, the person who is fronting the Labour Party, has been overly and wrongly praised for his forensic skills in examining the relevant regime's stance on getting the UK out of Europe or the European Union. UK is never out of Europe because it is in Europe. It's the European Union, that particular bloc. Now, what has happened with his period since he took over from Corbyn? So this April, May, June, July, August. April, May, June, July, August. There's 5 months. 5 months is a long time, especially when the circumstances of his kind of succeeding Corbyn have been accompanied, maybe coincidentally, by this appearance of the COVID-19 virus and the appearance also of the total unpreparedness by the state to deal with this, or at least that has been the appearance, because what has happened is that this whole approach by the Boris Johnson fronted government has been linked with the herd immunity, HERD, herd immunity agenda, which has been traced to Dominic Cummings and others in his ilk, or of his ilk, that they have been looking for this as an excuse. And so they have been looking for as many people as they can manage to allow to get killed. But the WSWS.org has described this as a mass murder or massacre or mass murder policy by Boris Johnson. Whichever variation, it is the same thing. People have been killed and allowed to be killed by negligence. And there is still no clue as to how or how many stages of the negligence were kind of crossed or passed before the person was, or the persons were allowed to be killed. And then there is this no resuscitation order. I mean, where does it come from? And why is that not being debated hotly by the opposition? And there is no sign that the opposition, and that doesn't include just the Labour Party, but even the smaller ones, the so-called Lib Dems and the SNP, they're not making any noise about that. So this is a moment that will go down in history of this country or these countries if Scotland disappears away from the United Kingdom because of Boris Johnson and other Brexiteers' kind of monstrous breaches of the law and international law. This is the moment when all the negligence and all the kind of lack of care and all the prejudices that are normally the subject of at least temporary outrage in the kind of mainstream media, they have not been treated as reasons for running front page splashes of outraged kind of reaction at the numbers of people being killed and the numbers of people being allowed to be neglected, to be killed. It's like all these large numbers of people being killed has been normalized in this country. And when they say that there is this new surge coming in October and there will be large numbers of people dying, that's the news on the lines today from the World Health Organization. It is incredible that this is happening in Western Europe, the destination regions. For all these people fleeing their countries to save their lives, and they're heading for Western Europe. And this is happening in Western Europe. In terms of the culture, it is happening at the center of Western Europe. Germany, France, the UK, these are in terms of the culture and the values generally at the center of these kind of claims of standards and adherence and rule of law and due process. And these are being chucked out of the window without any problem. That is, without any problem of having to explain or resign. There is no such choice, there is no such pressure, despite the fact that the licensed law traders are staging their little kind of careeristic negotiating stunts, saying that they are resigning or they will resign from the cabal or being fans in the cabal of Boris Johnson. I mean, Rahman Chisti, that name spelling is Rahman is quite suspicious. And we'll talk about nomenclature at another time. But Rahman Chisti, who is from a Kashmiri background and has a kind of Muslim sort of name, but he may not adhere to the Muslim culture, or he may not fully identify himself as Muslim, just like Sadiq Javid has distanced himself from the Muslim culture and the kind of general alliance or affinity with the Muslim background. So Rahman Chisti has been in parliament for about 10 years, according to his resignation letter today. He staged his resignation from a miniature role, and he's kind of staging this in order to make a mark. Rahman Chisti is not, on the record in the last 10 years, is not somebody that has made any principled objection to the conservatives or the racists at all. So he's just doing what other licensed law traders are doing, just to have a kind of record in their CVs that they did that. It doesn't amount to putting Boris Johnson or Dominic Cummings under any significant pressure at all, as I said earlier. The one reason is that they've got 80 plus or around 80 MPs, and that is a significant majority when it comes to voting. And the Tories have always protected the Tories, despite the appearances and the big sort of boasts about the heavyweights like Dominic Grieve and other MPs that were supposedly stalwarts in the campaign, so-called, among the Tories against the Brexiteering kind of steamroller. So they exited and they got defeated, and they actually are nowhere to be seen in terms of active politics. So some of them are popping up this week and staging stunts showing that they are doing this because the breaking of the law is going too far or has gone too far. And this internal market bill contains too many illegalities, unconstitutionalities, breaches of the law, and all that kind of slogan. But that these stunts will remain stunts. Just like the United Nations, as I have been telling Antonio Guterres, I hope I'm pronouncing the Portuguese name correctly. The point is that his kind of spewing or spieling of these trendy slogans and posts on the Twitter and other social media platforms. As I said, standing next to the image of Nelson Mandela or the image of Martin Luther King Jr. These are not the works of a seriously concerned Secretary General of the United Nations at such a critical time. Because the United Nations was founded to prevent the things that are happening now. Mark this. Just pause for a minute and listen to this again. The United Nations was founded to prevent the things that are happening now. So what's the point of the United Nations? Has the United Nations stopped the wars and the genocides and the like? It hasn't. That's the truth. And today, when the United Nations human rights thing is sitting in Geneva and issuing complacent rituals from the president and from the other person who was supposedly talking about the Rohingyas, they didn't actually connect with the realities on the ground across the world, across the member states, not just the fact that they failed to connect with what is happening in Burma or by Burma, but other similar perpetrations, various degrees of difference, but essentially leading to the mass murders of people, civilians. Most of the casualties of these lunacies that are going on inside and by the UN member states are civilians, children, women, and very vulnerable people, and they're all innocent. So what is the actual intervention that the United Nations is delivering? It doesn't seem to be evident from those events, nor from the brazenness of the British Daily Mail, which is celebrating the grotesque depth of descent into darkness by the Home Office, which is fronted by the daughter of asylum seekers from East Africa. I mean, where next? And so therefore, and the other thing I have said on the evidence, the reason why this is so many editions of the diagnosis of the fleet state of one day is obvious. It should be self-evident because there is so much to diagnose, so many wrongs to diagnose, so many emptiness, so many kind of acts of cruelty and negligence perpetrated in the pages and by the printed media that have to be actually spotted and put before the camera, in front of the camera, and actually shown that it is not a speculation, it is actually happening. Now, when it comes to breaking the law, international law, or any law, and when it comes to due process, and when it comes to Magna Carta, which Ed Miliband is the name that I have given him. The Miliband spewed, I don't even call it spiel, he spewed a kind of routine ritualistic concern about the breaches of the law by Boris Johnson and his gang. And the gang has been used by Andrew Ronsley in The Observer, Boris Johnson and his gang. So I'm not inventing it. I'm actually kind of evidentially citing the use of the word. So Ed Miliband actually used his few minutes on the BBC, shown today, at least I have checked it in the last kind of, I think 50 minutes. And he used the Magna Carta. He referred to the Magna Carta. Now he reminds me of the speech given by Tony Benn's son, the MP Hillary Benn, in the immediate aftermath of Corbyn being elected and Hillary being defeated. And Hillary Benn was made a hero by Fleet Street and the right-wing media that wanted to destabilize the just kind of installed Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. So Hillary Benn made a speech saying we created the international order, the human rights and law and order, and all that kind of thing. He gave a speech. And that was treated as a landmark speech by Hillary Benn. Now, where is Hillary Benn today? And what has he been doing to realize those boasted of contributions and role played by the British politicians and political institutions to the international order of civilized kind of life and relationship atmosphere after the 1945 kind of so-called defeat of the Nazis. I say so-called because the Nazis have never been defeated, and the Nazis are behind the driving wheels in most of the European countries, as they are in the USA driving Donald Trump and many of his supporters, including the thugs in Oregon. Just before it was hit by the cyclone, Oregon had the bizarre thing of Black Lives Matter supporters being beaten up by very heavily built thugs, supporters of Trump and supporters of racism. So where is the United Nations in all this? In relation to all this, where is the United Nations in defending the people of Yemen, Palestine? And that is the question which I have to ask today, on the day when they started this sitting. And they're saying that these sittings will continue up to the 6th of October. So we'll have reason and occasions to update on what they do in the later sittings. But today, it was about Rohingyas. And I didn't hear anything from either the reporter, the person who reported the kind of findings, nor from the delegate, one delegate that I heard, and I didn't hear the others. But I think the one I heard would be the average representative of the complacency and the very shallow level of involvement in the protection of the Rohingyas and the campaign within the organization to have the perpetrators properly brought to book. And this was a Pakistani person. And the Pakistani person very significantly praised the Bangladeshi persons. They were not yet speaking when I was watching, so I just had time to just see that part. And what it boils down to is that the United Nations agencies, as I said in previous editions, are doing rubber stamping bureaucratic things and are not actually delivering the protection that they were set up for, or the United Nations as a whole was founded for. And all over the world today, there are villains and thugs in powerful positions in the states that are members of the United Nations. But they are talking about concern. These deliberate, the people who are taking part in the sitting today in Geneva, or have done, as I have seen, are doing the absolutely textbook bureaucracy. I have suffered so many of these spectacles over the decades. And that the more I see, the more I suffer, the more kind of convinced on the evidence I become that they cannot deliver the protection for the people. And they haven't done. I mean, today's dire news by the World Health Organization, which is another UN organization, that more people will die in October and November, is no help at all. It should be saying how the deaths occurred in the first place and how the people will have to be protected from further deaths. But there is nothing in the news that has been released by the WHO today. So all of these kind of failure to comply with the law, failure to uphold the due process, failure to actually implement the due process. Who does that? Who does the examining of whether that is being done or not, whether the rule of law is being kind of complied with or not? Simple question, isn't it? And the answer is, of course, the judges, the judiciary. Now, what happens if the judges themselves are DNA liars, that is, born liars, and born vile persons who got into positions in the judiciary by tricks? Because there is no auditing, there is no examining the behavior, the mindsets of most of the judges and judiciary. In the UK, there are things like, or in England, which is led by England, Wales is the tail they use racistly to make England come across as more important, just like they have been doing with Scotland and getting up the backside of these Scottish people, insulting them routinely and regularly. Now, what happens if there is a judicial kind of system which is a bureaucracy, not a system delivering the accountability, delivering the audit? Well, it means that there is absolutely no implementation of the due process as it is advertised. And that is exactly what has been existing in England, quote, and Wales, and in the rest of the UK, with some slight exceptions. Now, as I have been saying from the beginning of these broadcasts are world exclusive because they're based on studies. I'm not carrying a script, but I'm actually delivering the findings, the results without a script. So it's the same thing, because I'm not in any way adding anything to replenish the presentation. I'm actually giving the substance, the core of the findings. And the findings are across the decades. So they are not like recent or just today's. I'm updating versions, but the substance remains the same. Substance of the finding remains the same. So in the police system, where there is an example in Tower Hamlets, East London, where the election commissioner, Richard Morey, banned Lutfur Rahman from public office for 5 years. And the reason why he did that, he said, was Lutfur Rahman was guilty of corrupt practices. Let me just read this exact thing that Morey said. And I'm coming to the reason why the newspaper, the Fleet Street and the Daily Mail, are at one with each other, regardless of their color and presentation. And here is an item from the 22nd of June, 2017 on the BBC website, which says Lutfur Rahman loses High Court appeal against election ban. So that's the item. Now, in that piece, they're recalling what Richard Morey had said in summary. And they're saying that about 26th of January 2016, And on that occasion, on that date, the BBC displayed the pictures, group pictures of three of the petitioners: Andy Arlam, Angela Moffat, and Azmal Hussain. And that is the thing. And what they say is, in the BBC, they accuse Lutfur Rahman of electoral fraud. So let's put that one. Mori in his judgment said the corrupt practices, and these people are saying that, or said that Lutfur Rahman was corrupt or practiced corruption or fraud, electoral fraud. What happened? I mean, is fraud a minor thing or is it a major thing? Obviously, it wasn't minor, because the person who was accused of doing that was thrown out of publicly elected post for 5 years. So it was treated as serious enough to cause him to lose that position of publicly elected position and was banned for 5 years. What does it mean? It means that the electoral petition or electoral commissioner recommended that the findings that came over and came across during the hearing of the petition should be treated as grounds for criminal prosecution. So there hasn't been any prosecution of Lutfur Rahman. So, and I have discussed this before, why there hasn't been, because it's not because straightforward legal reasons. There have been external reasons to do with all kinds of things, including the British military marketing to the Saudis and the Saudis' influence on Britain as a result, as a reciprocal thing. Now, quite apart from that, and in addition to that, the existence of the court system doesn't mean that there will be action by the courts against those who break the law or are criminals. Think about that. The fact that the courts exist, the fact that there are, quote, laws against wrongdoing, against corruption, against fraud, against cheating and deception, etc. These are theft, of course. Doesn't mean that there will be prosecutions against those or of those who are known to have done those wrongs or crimes. And there is a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is that the police in England and Wales, the police are supposed to be the actual gatherers of information. And it's the police who are the first tier of the substantive bureaucracy against the rule of law. So I'm not saying this against any individually named police person in this broadcast. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the police quote system is such that it serves as a deterrent against prosecution of criminals or wrongdoers, because it becomes a mainly darkness. I mean, it's a subjective opinion formed by the individual police persons or personnel looking at a particular case, and they decide whether to send the recommendation to the Director of Public Prosecution or the Crown Prosecution Service, whose head is the Director of Public Prosecutions, for further action. And the DPP then acts as the final stage of the bureaucracy in the decision as to whether to prosecute somebody or not. The police do not prosecute. It's the Crown Prosecution Service, as the name self-evidently gives it. The Crown Prosecution Service has to prosecute or initiate the proceedings. So in thousands and thousands and thousands of cases where crimes are committed and everyone knows they are committed and have been committed, no prosecution takes place. There is this typically corrupt excuse. It is not always corrupt, but it is most of the times corrupt because it lets the wrongdoers get away. Sometimes, very rarely, as empirically I have experienced, it is true. There is no enough evidence to prosecute. That is one phrase. Or there is no likelihood or chance or prospect of success or successful prosecution. These are totally vague and untested in rigorous, evidential, open, transparent examination of all the evidence available. And there is no forum, there is no platform, there is no avenue where these phrases or their veracity or their truthfulness can be tested objectively. So the English law system is corrupt from the beginning, or it is unaccountable from the beginning, and it is left to individuals in those posts in either the police or in the CPS to make the decision whether to proceed and prosecute X or Y. And then when they do that, there is, of course, the numerical, the statistical kind of variable, the likelihood of some of these decisions being unreliable. But the majority of the decisions to not prosecute, including the case of Tower Hamlets and the corrupt practicing former mayor Luthuraman, these are not open to doubt because everyone knows that Tower Hamlets Council had been deeply sunk in corruption as it is now. And Luthuraman has been backed, maybe not intentionally, by John Biggs, who took over on the 11th of June 2015. But Biggs has to protect the left behind mess left behind by Luthuraman, because if he doesn't protect and hide and cover up Luthuraman's kind of stuff, then Biggs himself will be exposed as equally wrongly acting in his capacity as the mayor. And as has been found in the case of the former employee who brought a tribunal case for unfair dismissal or something against the council, this man called Edmonds, he was obviously unsuccessful in the tribunal. And as I said in a previous comment, that is absolutely true. He was unsuccessful in the tribunal. But he succeeded, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most people who have objectively and fairly and honestly observed the proceedings and the behavior of John Biggs-fronted council, that he actually succeeded in bringing light, attention to the depth of corruption in the youth service and in the rest of the council, and also the absence of action by the police to protect somebody who had been threatened, sent death threats by the gang or gangsters involved in the corruption in the youth service or via the youth service or youth service. And as I have said, the failures of Tower Hamlets Council to provide safeguarding children included in my commentary. It has not been commented on by the East London Idiotizer or even the Guardian or anybody. I have been the one that pointed this out, and it will be the real substance of the allegation against Tower Hamlets Council when it comes to the full recognition of its failures to protect these girls, these Shamima Begum and her friends, from getting radicalized or whatever influence they were influenced by or penetrated by in the sense of brainwashing and contacts. I am not meaning penetration in any other sense. What I'm saying is that the actual intensity of influence that they were kind of brought under was obviously extensive and very detailed and was carried out over a significant amount of time. When the youth service and the additionally funded outfit in the Tower Hamlets Council to prevent radicalization allegedly, they should have been active, and they should have been actively doing their job of preventing these children being exposed to things that were very dangerous for themselves and for the rest of society. But they weren't. Tower Hamlets Council didn't do anything to even realize that it had a duty to protect these girls, these girls and others in their position. So what happened to this failure to carry out the law, implement the law, the legal obligations? Did the court system come into play? No. Did the police prosecute the council? No. Did anybody else, the DPP, prosecute the council? No. So that is how the cycle of breaking the law continues, apparently on a small local scale. But it's not small, it's not confined to the just local state. It encompasses, it includes the highest echelons in the state machinery, which is dysfunctional when it comes to delivering protection and safety and respect to the community and the citizens. So I'm combining the coverage or cover-ups by Fleet Street on the human rights violations and breaches by Boris Johnson and others, and also entire Fleet Street diffused, completely kind of deliberately self-imposed blindness, unable to see the breaches of the law, and even unable or unwilling to recognize, let alone report, the start of the proceedings on the Human Rights Council today until the 6th of October. So the fact that there is call and clamor for due process and the rule of law and all the rest of it, these are empty slogans, both locally, centrally, nationally, in terms of states. I don't mean in any way nationalistic national, but state, nation states. That's the difference. And the United Nations is staging a routine. So the world is exposed to serious risks of harm of the ordinary people because the states are failing. And the token organization that has become a token organization that is in existence to monitor the state's role to safeguarding their whole citizenship and citizenry is itself reduced to a joke. And so therefore we have a crisis that is bigger than the crisis facing Boris Johnson or facing the UK population due to Boris Johnson's unfitness and unwillingness to do the duty and to uphold the law. The entire series of tiers, if you like, TIERS, the stages of the bureaucracies, locally, regionally, centrally, and internationally. These are bureaucracies and not missions to uphold the rights of the people. There is a difference. And I am going to continue this in the next edition, where we'll be looking at the Financial Times of today, Monday, the 14th of September, 2020.